Hey there, welcome back. This is Matthew, and this is Dark Ascent. Today I'm showing you the Manaslu expedition, where a couple's ego and the lies they spread set off a horrifying chain of events that trapped innocent climbers in the death zone. And while I've covered a lot of dark stories on this channel, this is one of the few where the aftermath will permanently scar you. It was September 24th, 2015, and Manaslu Base Camp sat under the kind of gray sky that never fully committed to rain or clearing. Just a flat, heavy ceiling that pressed down on the Buri Gandaki Valley and made the glacier beneath it groan. The camp sprawled at roughly 15,750 feet across a moraine shelf littered with loose rock and meltwater channels that turned to slush by noon and refroze by dark. Wind funneled up the valley in erratic gusts, snapping tent fabric and carrying the faint sulfur smell of glacial silt. Prayer flags strung between cairns had been bleached pale by months of ultraviolet exposure. The sound of the valley never stopped. Wind, rockfall from the lateral moraines, and somewhere deep beneath the camp, the slow grinding of ice on rock. Manaslu is the 8th highest mountain on Earth, 26,781 feet, and among commercial mountaineers, it carried a very specific reputation. This was the proving ground, the peak where you built the 8,000-meter resume that got you accepted onto an Everest expedition. A Manaslu summit proved you could function above 26,000 feet without supplemental oxygen and make decisions in an environment that punished hesitation. The mountain was deceptively dangerous. Its lower sections were moderate enough to build false confidence, but the upper route funneled through a narrow ridge section above 25,500 feet, where fixed ropes could only accommodate traffic in one direction. And beyond that, the plateau between Camp 3 and Camp 4 was avalanche-prone terrain where whiteout conditions could erase every landmark in minutes. Climbers who lost the wanded route on that plateau wandered into crevasse fields and wind-loaded slopes that the path was specifically threaded to avoid. Among the tents at base camp was a mid-tier Kathmandu-based expedition. 10 clients, a shared pool of Sherpa support, and a set of assumptions about each other's competence that would prove fatal before the season ended. Ryan Caldwell was 41, from Denver, Colorado, a former brand consultant who had shifted into adventure content creation 3 years earlier. Brooke Caldwell was 37, a fitness and wellness content creator who had built a following around endurance challenges. They were polished, photogenic, and articulate, the kind of clients who looked exactly like what their social media advertised. And from everything I found putting this story together, that gap between how someone presents and what they can actually do is where this entire disaster began. Their assigned climbing Sherpa was Temba Chiring, 33, with 10 seasons in high-altitude guiding and 6 8,000-meter summits, including Manaslu twice. Raised in the Khumbu Valley, he was quiet and deliberate, the kind of guide who noticed a client's crampon technique on day one and filed it away without comment. He supported a wife, a young son, and his widowed mother on seasonal guiding income. Other expedition leaders requested him by name because he reduced problems rather than creating them. That's something I keep thinking about. The people most qualified to prevent these disasters are the same people the system ignores when it matters. Also on the expedition was Elin Sundqvist, 44, Swedish, quiet and methodical in the way that earned respect rather than attention. She had summited Cho Oyu and Broad Peak over the previous 3 years, building her high-altitude resume through patient progression rather than shortcuts. She was the kind of climber who helped others adjust equipment without being asked and remembered every Sherpa by name. She had a teenage daughter at home in Stockholm, and every evening, her satellite messenger sent an automated check-in confirming she was alive. She carried a GPS device, though she had not loaded detailed waypoints for the upper sections. She relied on the wanded route and the expedition's standard practice of stationing a Sherpa on the plateau to guide descending climbers through. Her assigned Sherpa was a younger man in his late 20s with 4 seasons on 8,000-meter peaks. Competent, experienced enough for the role, but without the intimate knowledge of Manaslu's plateau that the expedition's dedicated descent support Sherpa possessed. That descent support Sherpa, an older, veteran climber who had guided on Manaslu 4 times, would be positioned on the plateau between Camp 3 and Camp 4 on summit day. His job was simple and critical. Wait with emergency supplies and guide descending climbers through the most dangerous section of the mountains. He knew every crevasse field, every wind-loaded slope, every subtle gradient, change that separated the wanded route from fatal terrain. He was the safety net. For the Caldwells, Manaslu was the next step, the 8,000-meter summit that would unlock Everest. Their application had listed impressive credentials: a Denali summit, an Aconcagua summit, extensive technical ice climbing experience. The operator accepted these at face value, standard for mid-tier companies that lacked the motivation to verify climbing resumes. None of it was true. The Denali claim was built on a guided trip that ended at 17,200 feet when weather forced a turnaround. They had posted photos from high camp in poor visibility, images ambiguous enough to pass as summit shots if no one looked closely. No one did. The Aconcagua claim collapsed under even less scrutiny. They had reached Camp 3 before Ryan developed altitude sickness, forcing a retreat. A group photo from another climber's camera on summit day, where their absence from the actual summit team wasn't obvious, became their proof. The technical ice climbing amounted to a weekend course in Ouray and a handful of gym sessions, but the credentials existed on their profiles and on the application, and that was enough. When I first came across the details of their application, I actually went back and reread it twice. It's one thing to exaggerate, it's another to fabricate an entire climbing history from scratch. The acclimatization rotations began in late September and revealed the Caldwells in increments. On the first rotation to Camp 1 at 17,700 feet, they performed adequately on moderate terrain, but Temba noticed Ryan's crampon technique, feet placed flat on angled ice instead of front-pointing, ankles rolling on traverses. These were the mistakes of someone who had spent very little time in crampons on actual mountains. Temba adjusted his bindings and said nothing. On the second rotation to Camp 2 at 21,000 feet, the gaps widened. Brooke fumbled with her mechanical ascender at every transition on the fixed ropes, handling the device with the hesitation of someone learning the motion rather than repeating it. Ryan was the slowest client in the group. I keep coming back to that, the slowest in the group. On a resume that claimed Denali and Aconcagua, Temba raised his concerns privately with the expedition leader after the second rotation. The response was predictable. The leader acknowledged the slow pace, but pointed to the resume. Denali, Aconcagua, technical ice experience. Everyone had off days. They would sharpen up. The fabricated credentials did exactly what they were designed to do. They created enough doubt about the evidence of incompetence to prevent the intervention that should have happened. And that right there is the moment that cost people their lives. A Sherpa with 10 seasons and 6 summits raises a flag, and it gets overruled by a piece of paper full of lies. The third, rotation to Camp 3 at 23,000 feet, removed any remaining ambiguity for Temba. Ryan froze on a steep ice section, stalling on the rope for several minutes while climbers queued behind him. His arms locked on the ascender in a grip that had more to do with fear than technique, his crampons scraping against ice rather than biting into it. Temba had to short rope him through terrain that anyone with the experience Ryan claimed would have managed alone. Brooke developed persistent headaches and nausea that worsened through the night at Camp 3. They retreated after one night, and Temba told the descent support Sherpa afterward that the couple climbed like people who had never been above 20,000 feet. The Caldwells responded by reinforcing their narrative. Social media posts from base camp framed struggles as mental toughness rather than inexperience. They avoided detailed conversations with other climbers about their previous ascents, deflecting with vague references to conditions rather than specifics that could be checked. The summit window opened on September 30th, 3 days of reduced wind and relatively stable conditions. The Caldwells departed base camp on September 27th and reached Camp 2 by the 28th. On the 29th, they pushed to Camp 3, with Ryan slower than any previous rotation. On September 30th, they pushed toward Camp 4 at roughly 24,600 feet. The Caldwells were visibly frightened by the plateau above Camp 3, the vast openness, the knowledge that crevasses hid beneath unmarked snow in every direction. They arrived at Camp 4 late afternoon. Behind schedule, Aylin and her Sherpa arrived on time, both strong. The descent support Sherpa positioned himself at his station on the plateau at roughly 24,000 feet. Hey, if you're following along and want to see more like this, a like and subscribe really does help the channel. Now back to the mountain. At midnight on October 1st, teams departed Camp 4 for the summit. Ellen and her Sherpa left first, moving at pace that reflected years of earned competence. The Caldwells and Temba departed roughly 30 minutes later, already behind before they started. By 3 in the morning, the separation was severe. Ellen's team had climbed past 25,800 feet. The Caldwells were at roughly 25,200 feet, their pace deteriorating rather than improving. Without supplemental oxygen, which was not used on Manaslu, where the entire point was proving you could function at 8,000 meters on your own physiology, every hour above 25,000 feet compounded the damage. Ryan's coordination was degrading visibly. His crampon placements, already poor at lower altitude, became unreliable. Brooke moved slightly better, but had slowed to match her husband's pace. And at this point in my research, I already had an inkling to where this was heading. But the specifics of how it unraveled were worse than anything I could have predicted. At 4:30, Temba told them it was over. Their pace meant they would summit too. Late for a safe descent, and afternoon weather on Manaslu was not something you gambled against. Ryan refused. Brooke sided with him. They insisted they would speed up. At 5:30, Temba radioed base camp and recommended aborting the Caldwell's attempt. His report went to the expedition Sirdar in Nepali. The Sirdar relayed the concern to the expedition leader, who radioed the Caldwells directly. Ryan responded calmly, reporting their altitude as approximately 26,000 feet and describing their progress as steady. Their actual position was roughly 25,600 feet. Temba heard the false claim and did not contradict it on the open radio channel, not because he couldn't, but because the professional reality of commercial mountaineering made that act career-threatening. Sherpas who publicly overruled paying clients got assigned fewer clients in future seasons. The power imbalance was structural. Temba communicated his assessment to the Sirdar privately, but the expedition leader now had conflicting reports. The client who said 26,000 and steady versus the Sherpa who said lower and struggling. He compromised. Continue, but with a hard turnaround time of 8 in the morning. If they weren't on the summit ridge by then, they descended. I want you to sit with that for a second. A man with no business being above 25,000 feet just lied his way past the one safeguard designed to bring him down alive, and the system let it happen because it was built to trust the client over the guide. They were not on the summit ridge by 8. At 7:55, while Temba was roughly 50 feet ahead on the fixed line, scouting a route around a section of wind slab, Ryan keyed his radio and reported that they had reached the summit ridge and were making their final push. Their actual position was approximately 26,100 feet, over 600 vertical feet below the summit. Temba did not hear the transmission. The expedition leader granted an extension. The turnaround, the last safeguard, was removed based on a lie told by a man whose judgment was already compromised by the altitude he had no business being at. 2 lies on the radio, 2 safeguards gone, and the people who would pay for those lies were already on their way down. By 8:30, Temba returned to find them still climbing and learned the turnaround had been extended. He radioed base camp immediately with their true position. But the damage was compounding. More conflicting reports, more back and forth, precious time bleeding away. What happened next turned a crisis into a catastrophe. Ellen and her Sherpa had summited at approximately 8:15 and begun their descent, moving well, on schedule. By 9 in the morning, they reached the narrow ridge section above 25,500 feet, the stretch where fixed ropes could only handle traffic in one direction. The Caldwells were still on those ropes, crawling upward at a pace that had slowed to single steps between rest stops. Ryan was hunched over his ascender, barely moving. Brooke was 10 feet behind him, swaying with the heavy-limbed exhaustion of someone whose body was consuming itself. Ellen and her Sherpa could not pass. The ridge was too narrow, the exposure on both sides too severe, and the fixed ropes too few for two-directional traffic. They clipped into an anchor and waited. At 26,000 feet, without supplemental oxygen, waiting was not a neutral act. Every minute standing still cost energy, body heat, and cognitive function that could not be recovered. The cold worked through layering systems and settled against skin. Muscles cooled and stiffened. The clock that governed their safe descent was burning down while they stood motionless, watching 2 people who should have been turned around hours ago block the only way down. And this is the part that made me angriest putting this together. Ellen couldn't even make a decision about her own survival because someone else's lies had taken the route away from her. The delay lasted approximately 40 minutes. 40 minutes at 26,000 feet without oxygen. By the time the Caldwells cleared the section and the ropes were available, Ellen had lost nearly an hour of her descent window, time that would have put her safely below the plateau before the weather turned. At 9:15, immediately after the bottleneck cleared, Ryan collapsed. He dropped to his knees on the snow, then slumped sideways against the fixed line, his weight pulling the rope taut. His eyes were open but unfocused, his breathing shallow and rapid, his skin carrying the gray undertone of someone whose body was shutting down. The summit was still over 500 vertical feet above them. Temba radioed base camp. Emergency. Client incapacitated, requesting immediate support. Ryan was dead weight at 26,200 feet, and Temba could not get him down alone. The response was automatic. The expedition leader radioed the descent support Sherpa on the plateau and ordered him to abandon his position, grab the emergency oxygen bottle cached at Camp 4, and climb to Temba's location. The decision followed the iron logic of high-altitude emergencies. An incapacitated climber above 26,000 feet took absolute priority, and I think that's the thing that makes this story so hard to sit with. Every decision in that moment was defensible, every single one, and it still killed people. The descent support Sherpa left his station and began the climb. From 24,000 feet to 26,200 feet was over 2,200 vertical feet of ascent at extreme altitude, roughly 2.5 hours even for a strong Sherpa. Meanwhile, Ellen and her Sherpa were descending below the bottleneck, already 40 minutes behind schedule, working their way toward a plateau that now had no one waiting on it. He reached Temba and the Caldwells at approximately 11:30, carrying the emergency oxygen. It was administered to Ryan, who stabilized enough to be hauled on short rope. Temba, the descent supporter, Sherpa, and the two Caldwells began the descent. By now, the plateau had been unmanned for over 2 hours. At 11:30, the weather broke. Cloud poured in from the south with the speed that was common on Manaslu in autumn, but always faster than anyone expected. Visibility collapsed. Wind increased from manageable to dangerous within 30 minutes. The plateau vanished beneath a gray ceiling that erased every feature. I need you to brace yourself here, because what comes next is something I still haven't been able to shake. Aylin Sundqvist and her Sherpa reached the plateau at approximately the same time the whiteout settled, 40 minutes later than they would have arrived without the bottleneck. 40 minutes that would have put them below the worst of it. Instead, they walked into it blind. The wanded route, bamboo markers placed every 50 to 100 feet, became invisible beyond 2 or 3 wand lengths. Every direction looked identical. The wind carried snow horizontally, eliminating shadows and depth perception. Ellen had a GPS device, but had not loaded detailed waypoints for the plateau. Her Sherpa was competent, 4 seasons on 8,000-meter peaks, but he had guided on Manaslu only once before. He did not carry the mental map that the descent support Sherpa held from 4 seasons of working this specific section. That man knew every crevasse, every wind-loaded slope, every subtle change in snow texture that signaled the boundary between safe ground and fatal terrain. That man was 2,000 feet above them, hauling Ryan Caldwell down the mountain. They navigated by compass and the intermittent wands they could locate, but they drifted together. On Manaslu's plateau, the wanded route existed because everything on either side of it was designed to kill you. Crevasse fields to the west, wind-loaded avalanche slopes to the east. 100 meters off-route put a climber on terrain the path was specifically threaded to avoid. The snow beneath their crampons changed texture, firmer, wind-packed, but without a reference point. The shift meant nothing. A woman who did everything right, who built her skills over years, who climbed conservatively, who had a daughter waiting at home, walking blind across a slope she never should have been anywhere near. 40 minutes later than she should have been there, because 2 people blocked a rope they had no right to be on. That one broke me. Ellen triggered a wind slab on a slope the wanded route bypassed entirely. The avalanche was small by Himalayan standards, a fracture line perhaps 60 feet wide, a slab that slid roughly 150 meters before piling into a shallow depression. Both Aylin and her Sherpa were caught in the slide. At that altitude, buried under 2 to 3 feet of debris, with no one within earshot, neither had a chance. Above them and behind them, Temba was fighting a descent that would cost him everything. He and the descent support Sherpa were hauling Ryan through the same whiteout, but the descent support Sherpa knew this plateau by memory, finding wands that were invisible until they were arm's length away, guiding the group through terrain he had navigated dozens of times before. The knowledge that saved the Caldwells was the same knowledge whose absence killed Elin. The physical cost of using it was staggering. Temba was doing the bulk of the labor, hauling Ryan's weight on short rope, breaking trail, holding tension through every traverse. The sustained effort generated sweat inside his gloves. The moisture saturated his liner gloves first, then wicketed into the insulation of his outer mitts. Once wet insulation froze, the gloves stopped insulating and started conducting, actively pulling heat from his fingers with every gust. He didn't stop to address it. Stopping meant losing time. Losing time meant losing the clients. And that's what stays with me about every one of these stories. The Sherpas always absorb the cost of someone else's decisions, every time. By the time they reached Camp 3, Temba had been climbing and hauling for over 14 continuous hours. His gloves were frozen through, his fingers were waxy white and completely without sensation. He didn't remove the gloves until he was inside the tent, because he already knew what had happened. The skin beneath was marble white and rigid, the fingers locked in a half-curled position that wouldn't straighten when he tried. Severe frostbite, both hands, the kind that doesn't recover. The descent support Sherpa looked at Temba's hands and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The Caldwells reached base camp over the following 2 days. Ryan was evacuated by helicopter to Kathmandu with severe altitude sickness. Brooke descended under her own power with assistance. Both survived. Ellen Sundqvist and her Sherpa were found 2 days later in the avalanche debris on the plateau, roughly 200 meters off the wanded route. They were within 15 feet of each other, both partially buried under compacted snow. Her satellite messenger had sent its last automated check-in the evening before the summit push. Her daughter in Stockholm received the news through the expedition operator before the recovery team had returned to base camp. The same weather collapse that killed Aileen caught climbers from neighboring expeditions on exposed sections of the descent. A Korean team lost a climber to a crevasse fall on the plateau in zero visibility, and a Sherpa from a separate expedition suffered fatal injuries in a fall on the upper face when wind gusts exceeded what the forecast had predicted. In total, 4 people died on Manaslu on October 1st, 2015. 3 of them on a plateau that had a safety net in place, until that safety net was pulled away to rescue a man who should never have been above Camp 2. 4 people. I want you to let that number sit with you for a moment. Temba Chiring lost 3 fingers on his right hand and 2 on his left to frostbite. He underwent multiple surgeries in Kathmandu over the following months. The damage ended his high-altitude career permanently. He was 33 years old with a wife, a young son, and no secondary income. He eventually found work at a trekking lodge in the Khumbu, carrying plates and folding linens, with hands that once held ropes on 6 8,000-meter summits. I sat with that image for a long time after putting this together. A 33-year-old clearing tables with 7 fingers because 2 people from Denver couldn't tell the truth. The expedition's GPS tracker, carried by Temba, confirmed the Caldwells never exceeded approximately 26,200 feet. The summit of Manaslu is 26,781 feet. Their false radio reports were cross-referenced against the data, and the timeline collapsed immediately. When investigators contacted the operators of their claimed Denali and Aconcagua expeditions, those credentials fell apart too. Neither company had records of the Caldwells reaching either summit. No criminal charges were filed. Nepalese mountaineering regulations in 2015 had no mechanism to prosecute false position reports or fraudulent credential submissions. The Caldwells attempted to maintain their summit claim after returning home. It lasted until other climbers published the GPS data online. Their social media accounts disappeared within the week.